everyone. Welcome to OT236, Occupational Therapy with Youth, and this is our lecture on school-based OT for youth. My name is Melisa Kaye, and I'm your instructor. Let's go ahead and get started. Our objectives for today include describing the scope of school-based OT for youth, explaining some of the legislation, in particular IDEA and the 504 plan, discussing factors around transition for youth, so going from school to higher education, vocation, or work, and looking at that, and then exploring assessment and intervention approaches for youth. All right, so we're going to first look at OT in the schools. OT has a very broad role in the schools, and that is to facilitate development. We, of course, work on gross motor and fine motor. We also work on perceptual motor skills, in other words, the combining of the head, the brain and the eyes with the hands or with the feet, as the case may be. But generally, perceptual motor refers to eyes and hand together. We'll also be involved in ADLs and IADLs as they affect the student within the school environment. We look at leisure and recreation, sensory processing, and self-regulation. So in other words, how alert or engaged is the student, and how well can they match their level of alertness with the demands of the environment or the occupation. We'll also look at executive functioning, which in our child age clients becomes important, but it's especially important in this age because it's getting refined and becoming ever more necessary for the kinds of occupations that youth engages in. And finally, the all-important area of social interaction, because our youth are very, very involved in socializing with each other and moving away in many ways from engagement with their caregivers as the primary source of social. Service provision happens in two main ways, and you can kind of think of this classification system, both direct and indirect, and they're equally as important in different circumstances. So direct service provision would be any time when we're actually working with the student. It could be individual. We could be pushing into the classroom and working with them there. We could be pulling them out of the classroom, depending on what it is that we're working on. It could be working with a small group of students. It could be working with the whole class in which our client is actually a member. It could be modifying the environment or the task. But anytime that we're in direct contact or we're working directly for that student's needs, it's called direct service provision. Contrast that with indirect, which would be any time that we are working with anyone else that is on that student's team. So it could be the teacher, other staff in the classroom, other professionals, parents or caregivers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, anytime when we either educate or collaborate with or coach other folks who have an investment in our clients' skill building and success and participation, that's called indirect service provision. All right, so we're going to dive today into some legislation. We'll be looking at various kinds of legislation throughout the class, and it's important because it guarantees our youth clients services, and in particular, services in the schools. We'll also look at services outside the schools with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but for our purposes, we'll limit our legislative discussion to what happens in conjunction with school-based OT. We're going to talk about two different types of legislation. The first is IDEA, which we'll get to in just a moment, and the second is a 504 plan, and a 504 plan is associated with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I just told you we were going to do ADA later, and we will dig into it in much more depth, but today we'll be looking at a 504 plan. Okay, but here we are with IDEA, which stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There is a lot of language in it and a lot of specifics about how, when, why, who serves children in the schools. But for our purposes today, we'll look at some of the general tenets of this piece of legislation and also two parts of it. One is the IEP, or Individualized Education Plan. And the second is the ITP, or the Individualized Transition Plan. Now, IDEA, as we'll see, has been around since 1990, so not so very long, all things considered. And what it does is that it guarantees a free and appropriate public education that emphasizes special ed and related services, and you'll see that OT is a related service. And furthermore, it's designed to meet the needs of the particular student that is receiving special ed services, with a goal to preparing them better for higher ed, for moving into the work world, and for living independently. You can, throughout this presentation, consult the download, which is available to you, and that will have additional resources for you. There is one about policy and IDEA associated with this slide and throughout the presentation. So do be sure to check that out. All right, a little bit of history. So IDEA actually started in 1975 with a different piece of legislation, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. And that was the first time that any rights were really provided to kids with disabilities. It followed about 15 years later with IDEA. That was the first enactment of it. And then it was reauthorized in 1997. So we stepped it up, and what was added to it was this idea that services be provided within the context of the student's general ed curriculum. So rather than servicing and serving kids with disabilities totally separate from the general population, the reauthorization added this idea that we really want to see all the kids that are of a particular age actually educated together as much as is possible. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind legislation was passed, and this kind of tried to reinforce the idea that kids were slipping through the cracks, and we needed to prevent that from happening. This is beyond the scope of our discussion today, but it's a really interesting piece of legislation and also pretty political in some ways. So if you'd like, we can definitely discuss that. All right. And then in 2004, the IDEA was reauthorized again, and it looked at parts B and C of IDEA. So Part B covers children from 3 to 21 years of age. And when we think about youth in school, and we'll have a slide about this in a few minutes, we actually cover kids to their 22nd birthday. So that is our cutoff date. And then Part C covers kids from birth to 3. The reauthorization also supported something called response to intervention, which is a process that helps identify and figure out how we can best serve kids who are coming into the system. All right, there's a number of tenets that are associated with IDEA, and we're going to go through them briefly. We can, again, talk about this more in class and get any clarification that you might need. The first idea is called FAPE, or Free, and appropriate public education. So what FAPE says is that all states and public schools must provide a free and appropriate public education to differently abled students. It's got to be free because it's the public schools. It's got to be appropriate, right? So we can't just open up a special ed class and dump everybody with every disability under the sun into that class. It has to be an appropriate placement for the child or the youth who is accessing special ed services. Then we have Part B, which we talked about, relates to kids who are between 3 and 21, just shy of their up to their 22nd birthday, right? So the part that concerns us the most directly as OTs is this idea that we are a related service. What that means is that the youth has to be receiving special ed services, and then we can come in as a related service. We're not a standalone service. So if they're not receiving special ed services, they cannot receive OT. So this sometimes hinders kids from getting OT. For example, if they're in a private school and their parents or caregivers have made that decision and are paying for a private education, they can't access school-based OT and have school district pay for it. All right, so important to remember we are a related service, and we'll contrast that in a little while with how a 504 plan works. The services support the student's educational program. This seems totally obvious, right? Of course, we're going to support the student's educational program. What we need to keep in mind, though, is that if we want to provide some aspect of service that is not educationally related, we can't do it under school-based services. So it gets a little tricky, and we will revisit this in terms of ADLs and IADLs, because is having clean hair and clean clothes and being properly dressed part of school-based services? In one way, no. But when you're a teenager, if you come and you're dirty or disheveled or not properly dressed, you're not going to be able to actually access your educational program or the whole school experience. So we'll revisit that. But remember that the services to get funded need to support the student's educational program. Next up, LRE, which stands for Least Restrictive Environment. And what that means is that if a student can access, say we have a youth who has autism, right? So they have some really significant communication and social difficulties. They may have repetitive and stereotype behaviors. They may have a very narrow band of interests, but they're an ace in science, or they do very well in history or math. What this least restrictive environment says is that we can't keep them just arbitrarily in their special ed placement all day long because it's easier. We actually have to offer them those classes in the regular ed environment, or even the AP classes, if that's what's appropriate. So the least restrictive environment means that those who need a lot of support will be in special ed classes that may not, and they may not mainstream in or be fully included into the general school population. But for those students who can tolerate a less restrictive environment, they may be placed in a regular education program with special services. They might be in special ed but get mainstreamed into particular classes. So there's a lot of ways it looks. But it protects students from being pigeonholed into a special ed class that is more restrictive or more isolated from the general education than they actually need. All right. And then our final tenet is that OT is part of the educational team. So teams have a number of people on them, and OT is one of them. There may be, there will be the student, their parents or caregivers or guardians, special ed teacher, regular ed teacher, an administrator, which is often but not always the principal. There may also be psychologist, physical therapist, speech and language pathologist, behavioral therapist, adaptive physical education specialist, a resource specialist, an advocate, a nurse if they have medical issues. So lots and lots of different people form the team, and OT has an equal part and responsibility on that team. All right. So this is a visual that I developed to show you kind of how the flow of OT and IDEA. I don't know why I'm having trouble saying that today, probably because I'm recording myself. Okay, so this is just a visual to show you kind of how it hooks together. So we have this occupational performance area in red on the left, which is education, right? And then in orange in the middle, we have three different aspects of education. We have academics, we have non-academic stuff, and we have extracurricular stuff. They all fall within our purview because they're all related to the occupational performance area of education. So with academics, I gave you some examples of reading, writing, and math. With non-academics, we would have recess, lunch, and self-help. And obviously, in high school, you don't always have recess, but you might have a free period, for example. But these non-academic times are just as important as the academic times, right? So if a kid is not able to access lunch, not able to purchase their lunch in the cafeteria or manipulate the containers that lunch comes in, not able to figure out where to sit or when lunch is over, that's going to be a problem. So OT has a role there. And then finally, there's extracurriculars, and they could include sports, art, music, or clubs. And so we have a role in helping students access those things as well.